The suitor arrived in a ship that was, objectively, too large for the occasion. This was the first thing Zarin noticed from the high observation deck of the Vel Kais palace, where she had stationed herself with a cup of something warm, and the private intention of getting the measure of him before the ceremony required her to be pleasant. The vessel descended through Varsetha's amber atmosphere with the slow, self-conscious grandeur of something that had been designed not merely for travel, but for the specific purpose of being watched while traveling, its hull etched with the Vethali dynastic markings that caught the morning light and redistributed it in ways that suggested a significant budget and an equally significant need for validation. Zarin drank from her cup. Beside her, her attendant Reth made a small sound. "The forward stabilizers are decorated," Reth observed. "I noticed. Purely decorative, they've been gilded." "I noticed that too." Reth was quiet for a moment. "The stabilizers are functional components." "Yes," Zarin said, "they are." There was a pause in which they both watched the ship complete its descent, with the ponderous dignity of a man who has practiced his entrance and is now performing it. "He gilded the stabilizers," Reth said again, apparently still processing this. Zarin finished her drink and set down the cup with the quiet resolution of someone who has made a decision that does not require further deliberation. "Let's go be welcoming." The court of Varsetha assembled itself with practiced elegance in the primary reception hall, a space that had been designed over 3 imperial generations to communicate, to anyone standing inside it, a very specific sequence of impressions. First, the scale of Sekharan civilization. Second, the antiquity of the Vel Kais lineage. Third, the distinct possibility that whatever you had brought with you was slightly inadequate. The vaulted ceiling was threaded with bioluminescent filaments that responded to the population density of the room, brightening as the court filled, so that by the time the full assembly was present, the hall glowed with a warm and faintly living light that made everyone inside it look as though they were part of something significant. It was extremely effective. Visiting dignitaries frequently reported feeling simultaneously honored and subtly outclassed, which had been the precise intention of the architect and remained, several centuries later, a continuing success. Prince Iduval of the Vethali Compact was tall, broad-shouldered, and possessed of a confidence that had clearly never encountered adequate resistance. He processed down the reception corridor with 24 attendants arranged behind him, in a formation so precise it had obviously been rehearsed, wearing formal armor that managed to be simultaneously ceremonial and aggressive in the way of someone who wanted you to know he could wear both at once. His species had a slightly wider cranial structure than the Sekharan, with the kind of bone density that made them deeply difficult to injure in combat, and that had, over centuries of cultural reinforcement, produced in their nobility a collective personality that could generously be described as assured and less generously as comprehensively unbothered by the concept of a room that didn't want them in it. Zarin received him at the end of the hall with the full formal protocol, which involved 7 distinct gestures and a verbal greeting in both languages, all of which she executed with the fluency of someone who had been doing this since she could walk, and with the warmth of someone who had decided that none of this was the prince's fault, and that basic courtesy was not contingent on outcome. He was, she thought, not an unpleasant person. He spoke well. He had a sense of humor that surfaced briefly when he referenced the journey, describing a navigational detour that had added 6 hours to his travel time due to what his pilot had logged as an encounter with an uncharted debris field, and what he personally suspected was his pilot making a fundamentally optimistic calculation about a known hazard. This was mildly charming. She smiled genuinely at it, which she could see surprised him slightly, as if he had deployed the anecdote without fully expecting it to land. The reception banquet lasted 3 hours and proceeded without incident, which was the best outcome available, and the one Zarin had quietly engineered through careful table arrangement. The strategic placement of her most socially gifted courtiers near the prince's attendants, and a menu that had been selected to contain nothing that could produce an adverse biological reaction in Vethali physiology. A precaution that the court dietitian had pointed out was extremely considerate, and that Zarin had privately noted was also extremely convenient in that it removed a category of problem she didn't have time for. She sat beside him. She asked him questions and listened to the answers with the attention she gave everything, because the information was always real even when the situation was already resolved. He had strong views about coalition border policy that were not without logic. He had commanded forces in the Outer Reach campaign and spoke about it with a modesty that was practiced but not entirely performed. He had gilded his stabilizers, but she was willing to treat that as a separate matter. After the banquet, in the smaller receiving chamber where the formal answer was given and received, she thanked him. She was precise about what she was thanking him for: the journey, the conversation, the quality of his offer, which she acknowledged with the full ceremonial language reserved for genuine respect. Then she declined. He took it well, all things considered. There was a moment in which his expression did something complicated and then resolved into something controlled, and she watched that process and respected it. He asked no questions. He offered no counter. He simply bowed in the deep, formal Vethali style and said that he hoped she found what she was looking for, and there was something in the way he said it that suggested he suspected, perhaps, that she already had. She walked back through the corridor toward her own chambers with Reth at her side, and the quiet of the palace settling around them like something that had been waiting for the noise to stop. The bioluminescent filaments in the ceiling dimmed as the court dispersed. Somewhere in the eastern wing, one of the prince's attendants laughed at something, the sound carrying briefly and then disappearing. 17 drafts, Reth said after a while. 16, I sent 16. Of the message. Yes, to the human. You know who I mean, Reth. I do, Reth said. I'm simply observing that you declined a prince of the Vethali compact this evening, and then went directly to bed at an hour you haven't slept at in 6 months, and that the last thing you did before sleeping was send a message to a man 3 systems away who does not know that you exist. Zarin was quiet for a moment. He knows I exist. He treated my shrapnel wounds. He wrote your name phonetically on an intake form. He was thorough about the intake form. That's very romantic, Reth said, with the particular tone she used when she meant it and also didn't mean it at exactly the same time. Zarin stopped walking. The corridor was still. Through the high, narrow windows, the night sky of Varsetha showed its double moons sitting close together in the dark, the smaller one trailing the larger by the distance of a breath, the way it always did this time of year. She looked at them for a moment. Tomorrow, she said, I need to speak with my mother. Reth nodded slowly, with the expression of someone beginning to calculate the radius of an oncoming event. How much warning should I give her? None, Zarin said. Warning doesn't help her, it just gives her more time to prepare counterarguments. She resumed walking. Schedule it for mid-morning, and Reth bring tea, the good kind. Enough for 2 people having a difficult conversation. Should I bring enough for 3? Zarin considered this. Bring enough for 3. The ceasefire had lasted 43 days, which was approximately 43 days longer than anyone with direct knowledge of the Vethran corridor had expected it to last, and the collective mood in the coalition forward camp had developed the particular quality of people who know something is about to go wrong and have begun privately scheduling their anxiety around it. The camp occupied a strip of contested ground between 2 low ridgelines, established on the technical neutrality of a terrain feature that neither side had formally claimed, presumably because it was largely composed of compacted mineral dust that got into everything and tasted, as one of the coalition engineers had noted in an official report that someone had thought to file, like disappointment. Aidan Morse was in the middle of recalibrating the medical tent's atmospheric filtration unit when the ceasefire ended, a task he had been putting off for 2 weeks because the calibration required him to lie on his back underneath the primary housing with his arms, in positions that the human spine had not evolved to accommodate, and that produced, every time, a sequence of sounds from his shoulder, joints that his colleague Priya described as concerning, and that he described as normal. He had just achieved the correct angle and located the misaligned coupling when the first concussive impact registered through the ground. A deep lateral shudder that traveled up through the equipment housing and arrived in his back, with the unmistakable information that something large had detonated within a kilometer. He was on his feet in approximately 2 seconds. Priya was already moving toward the supply racks. Outside the tent, the camp noise changed in the way it always changed when something was actually happening, the ambient sounds of a functioning bass compressing suddenly into the sharper, more purposeful sounds of people who have stopped doing what they were doing and started doing something else. "So that's that," Priya said, pulling field kits from the second rack with efficient economy of motion. "That's that," Aiden agreed. "We had a good run. 43 days. I had it at 38. I had it at 50. "You're an optimist," she said. "I'm a medic, we have to be." She handed him a kit. He checked it in the practiced 3-second assessment that 11 years had reduced to something like a reflex. Contents, seals, the status indicator on the bioscanner, which was showing green except for the secondary probe which was showing amber, and had been showing amber for a week, because the replacement parts were still listed as in transit somewhere between the supply depot and here, which was a sentence that had described the replacement parts for so long that Aiden had begun to suspect they were simply in transit as a permanent condition, philosophically, without reference to any actual physical journey. The engagement lasted 6 hours. Aiden spent most of it in the tent with one eye on the horizon and both hands working, receiving the initial casualties from the coalition perimeter, 2 injuries from the early shelling, 1 evacuation from a patrol caught outside the neutral zone when the shelling started, 1 case of someone who had twisted an ankle running for cover, and was embarrassed about it in the specific way of people who are embarrassed to have a minor injury during a major event. Aiden treated the ankle with the same attention he gave everything else, and told the soldier, who was 22 and had been in the corridor for 3 weeks, and had the eyes of someone recalibrating their understanding of several things simultaneously, that an ankle that didn't get treated became a liability when you needed to move fast, and that there was no such thing as an injury too small to take seriously, and that the tea in the supply crate in the corner was real tea, not the synthesized kind, and he should have a cup before he left. The soldier had a cup. He left looking marginally less like someone recalibrating several things. The serious casualties arrived in the hours after the engagement wound down, carried or walked in from the perimeter with the dust of the engagement still on them. And it was here that the work became the thing that Aiden understood better than most other things, the full occupancy state in which everything that wasn't immediately relevant to the person in front of him became background and stayed there. He worked through them in the order of what would become catastrophic if unaddressed, which was the only order that mattered, and the afternoon moved in the way that afternoons in the field always moved, in the distorted time of sustained attention, where an hour could feel like 20 minutes, and a difficult procedure could expand to fill whatever space it needed. The Sekharan woman walked in under her own power at the end of the 3rd hour. He noticed her in the way he noticed all his walking arrivals. The gait assessment happened automatically. The visible injury evaluation happened automatically. The brief calculation of where she fell in the current hierarchy of urgency happened automatically. And he pointed her to the secondary surface and asked her 3 questions in coalition standard without pausing what his hands were doing. She answered all 3 in better coalition standard than roughly a third of the coalition soldiers he had treated today, which he noted and filed. He gave her a local analgesic compound for the shrapnel sites and told her he would be with her in 14 minutes, and she nodded with the composure of someone to whom 14 minutes was a perfectly acceptable answer, and who had not even marginally considered saying otherwise. He was with her in 11. The shrapnel was 3 pieces, 2 superficial and one that had made a more serious attempt at causing problems, and he worked carefully and talked as he worked in the way he always did, not performing calm but simply in it, narrating the process to no one in particular, noting each step with the verbal shorthand that had developed over years into something between a checklist and a conversation with the work itself. She didn't speak during it. Most patients talked, or tried to. She watched, with the large silver eyes that he had peripherally registered and not looked at directly because he was looking at his work, and her watching had the particular quality of someone who was doing more than passing time. He finished and ran the scanner over his work twice, and told her the 3rd piece had been determined, which was a word he used when something had given him more trouble than it deserved to, and had eventually been handled anyway. She asked what that meant. He said it meant it had tried to be interesting and he had declined to find it interesting. She considered this. She said that seemed like a reasonable policy. She stayed. That was the fact that entered his awareness first as an operational note and then, gradually, as something else. Her evacuation clearance came through at hour 5, and she didn't take it, which prompted him to check on her twice more in the intervals between other patients, not because she seemed to be in distress, but because a patient who had clearance and didn't use it was information. She appeared fine. She appeared, if anything, to be paying attention with a focus and a quality of stillness that he associated with people who were learning something, though what there was to learn in a field medical tent that she couldn't have learned elsewhere he couldn't have said. At hour 9, the veteran fighter came in, and Aiden heard the story from the 2 soldiers who brought him in, the secondary detonation, the specifics, and he listened to all of it, and then looked at the fighter for 2 seconds and began work. There wasn't a decision to describe. The decision had been made 11 years ago when he signed the commission, and 5 years before that when he decided what kind of person he was going to be about the question that medicine always asked you, which was whether the person in front of you was a person, and he had answered it once in a way that made answering it again unnecessary. He worked. He talked to the fighter in the steady, low voice he used when the words were secondary to what the voice was doing. He brought him back from the edge of the place where people went when they had lost too much blood and too much time, and when the fighter's reading stabilized, Aiden sat back for 3 seconds, which was his version of a rest, and then moved on. He didn't look at her when he did it. He wasn't performing anything. He was simply working, which was the only version of himself he knew how to be when the work was in front of him. He found out later from nothing she said directly that she had watched all of it. He found out later from the shape of what followed that she had found it significant. At the time he was simply tired in the clean, used-up way of a long shift done. And when she came to leave, she gave him her name, and he wrote it down in careful phonetic approximation on the intake form, and told her honestly that he hoped her system didn't give her any trouble. She said it wouldn't. She was right as it happened about that specific thing. The shrapnel sites healed without complication. Other things were, by that point, already considerably more complicated, though he wouldn't know that for another 6 months, and she wouldn't say so for reasons of her own. And the intake form with her name written in his careful, inadequate approximation sat in the closed file of a border skirmish that history was not going to find particularly notable, between 2 people who had briefly, in a contested place that smelled of dust and coolant and the specific exhaustion of too much happening at once, been in the same room, and who were going to find out, eventually, that rooms have a way of mattering. The Empress was already seated when Zarin arrived, which meant she had been told. This was the thing about having a court of several hundred people. Information moved through it, the way heat moved through metal, quickly and without asking permission. And the Empress had sources in every corridor of the palace who understood that their continued access to those corridors depended on keeping her apprised of developments before the developments arrived in person. She was sitting at the long table in her private receiving chamber with a cup of tea she hadn't touched. in the posture of someone who has arranged themselves into composure and intends to remain there regardless of what happens next. Reth set down the tray with 3 cups and retreated to a distance that was technically still the room but practically expressed a diplomatic neutrality. Zarin sat. Her mother looked at her for a moment with the specific expression she had developed over decades of governance, which conveyed simultaneously that she was listening, that she had already considered several possible versions of what she was about to hear, and that she was prepared to respond to all of them with measured reason. It was an extraordinarily useful expression. Zarin had been trying to learn it for years and could only produce about 60% of it, which her mother had once told her was actually quite good for someone her age, and which had not been as comforting as it was probably intended to be. "Reth tells me," the Empress said, "that you wanted tea." "I wanted tea," Zarin said, "the good kind." "Yes, enough for a difficult conversation." "Yes." Her mother looked at the tray. She brought 3 cups. "I told her to. In case it went very badly." "In case it went long," Zarin said, which was a distinction her mother acknowledged with a slight lift of one brow that suggested she understood the distinction, and also that she considered it optimistic. She picked up her cup. She drank from it slowly, with the consideration of someone who understood that the next few minutes were going to go a certain way, and was using the remaining seconds of the previous few minutes deliberately. Then she set the cup down and said, "Tell me." Zarin told her. She had rehearsed this, and the rehearsal held she moved through it in the order she had determined was clearest, which began with the Vethran corridor and the 43rd day, and the secondary detonation and the medical tent, and moved through the 14 hours without rushing them, because the 14 hours were the argument and they deserved their space. She used the formal vocabulary where it was appropriate, the recognition terms, the courage language, the full ceremonial weight of the mate bond acknowledgement, and she applied them carefully and correctly to each of the specific moments she had been carrying for 6 months, so that when she finished, the case was assembled and visible, and her mother could walk around it and look at it from any angle she chose. When she reached the end, she stopped. She did not add anything. She drank her tea and waited. The Empress was quiet for a duration that Zarin estimated at approximately 40 seconds, and that felt considerably longer. The chamber's environmental system moved air through it with a faint sound that Zarin had heard her entire life without ever consciously registering, and she registered it now in the specific way of someone whose awareness had sharpened past the point of filtering anything. "He is human," her mother said finally. "Yes. A field medic. Senior field medic." Her mother absorbed this distinction with the expression of someone deciding whether it changed anything. "In the Coalition Medical Corps." "Yes." Not a commander, not a political figure, not anyone with whom a partnership would carry strategic weight in any of the 6 outer systems currently under negotiation. "That's correct." "He is," the Empress said, with the precision of someone assembling a sentence they intend to be heard very clearly. "A human medical officer on a frigate 3 systems away, who treated your shrapnel wounds during a border engagement, and then, if I understand correctly, wrote your name incorrectly on an administrative form." "Phonetically approximately," Zarin said. "He was working under difficult conditions." Her mother looked at her. "The intake form was otherwise thorough," Zarin added. The Empress stood, which was what she did when she was thinking at a scale that required movement, and she crossed to the far window and stood looking out at the upper city, where the morning transit lanes were running their first heavy traffic. The small automated vessels moving in their prescribed arcs between the towers, everything functioning as it was supposed to function, orderly and comprehensible, and behaving according to its established parameters. Zarin watched her and waited, because her mother always came back from the window eventually, and because pushing the window process had never in her experience produced a better outcome than letting it complete. After a while the Empress said, without turning, "Does he know? I sent the communication last night. He hasn't responded. It's been 9 hours. He's likely on shift rotation. Or, her mother said, turning now. He read it and is currently somewhere on his frigate doing the specific kind of sitting down that news of this category produces in people. Zarin considered this also possible. Her mother returned to the table. She sat down again, and something in the quality of her sitting down had shifted. It was still composed, but the composure had moved from the defensive kind to something more like the working kind, the posture of someone who has finished the first phase of a response and is now beginning the second. She poured herself more tea. She poured a second cup and slid it toward Zarin. "The court genealogist," she said, "is going to arrive at my office this afternoon with scrolls." "Probably 11, Zarin said. Her mother looked at her. "I estimated 11. The diplomatic corps will send someone by tomorrow. Someone junior enough that it isn't a formal objection, but senior enough that it isn't easily ignored." Her mother was quiet for a moment. "You've thought about this?" "For 6 months." The Empress drank her tea. Outside, a transit vessel completed its arc and disappeared behind the eastern tower, and the lane reformed around its absence with the smooth indifference of a system that was used to things moving through it and leaving. When her mother spoke again, her voice had the particular quality it took on when she had moved from processing into something Zarin recognized as the register of actual conversation, the one she used when the performance of governance was briefly set aside, and she was speaking as the person underneath it. "Tell me the moment," she said. "Not the whole 14 hours, the specific moment." Zarin knew which one she meant. She had known when she prepared the full account that this would be the question underneath the other questions, and she had also known that she couldn't lead with it because it needed to arrive in its context, or it would sound like less than it was. She told her about the veteran fighter, the soldiers' faces when they brought him in, the 2 seconds, the decision that wasn't a decision, the steady voice working on someone who had been, hours earlier, the reason there was shrapnel in the left side of her body. She told it in plain language, and she didn't editorialize because it didn't need it. It stood on its own, the way true things usually did, without assistance. Her mother listened. She did not speak for a long time after. Then she said, "The court is going to be extremely difficult." "I know. The genealogist alone is going to be." 11 scrolls, Zarin said. "I'll see him at the 4th hour and give him 2 hours, which is enough to feel heard and not enough to build momentum." Her mother almost smiled. It was the precise almost smile of someone who was, against their initial intentions, finding something to appreciate. "And the human," she said. "What do you imagine he does when he reads your message and understands what it means?" Zarin was honest. "I think there's a period of sitting very still. Then I think he talks to someone he trusts. Then I think he responds carefully and probably at length, because that is consistent with what I observed of his approach to things." "Confused panic," her mother said in the tone of a woman who had read the summary. "Initially. And then—" Zarin picked up her tea. Through the window, the double moons were still visible on the horizon in the pale wash of morning, the smaller one trailing the larger, the way they always did, the familiar arrangement of things that had been in motion for longer than anyone watching them had been alive. "Then," she said, "I think he'll say something honest. He doesn't seem to know how to do it any other way." Her mother looked at her for a long, considering moment, in the way of someone taking a measurement. "Reth," the Empress said, raising her voice slightly. From her position of diplomatic neutrality at the edge of the room, Reth straightened. "Yes, Your Grace." "Pour the 3rd cup." The communication arrived on a Wednesday, which was, as far as Aiden Morse was concerned, a perfectly ordinary Wednesday until it wasn't. He was in Supply Bay 3, on his back underneath the atmospheric filtration housing with his arms in positions that his shoulder joints were registering as a formal complaint, when his comm unit signaled the priority flag. He finished tightening the coupling first, because the coupling had been waiting 2 weeks and the comm unit could wait 30 seconds, and then he extracted himself from underneath the housing with the careful dignity of a man who has learned that the floor will always be there, and that rushing the process only produces additional problems. He read it standing up. Then he sat down on the crate of field dressings. The message opened with full Sekharan imperial protocol, which was a density of formal language that took up nearly a third of the total length, and which his translation software, rendered with the slightly glazed quality of software, that was doing its best with vocabulary that had been designed for occasions significantly more ceremonial than a personal communication, to a coalition medic on a maintenance rotation. Beneath the protocol, in language that shifted register so completely it felt like a different document, she said that she remembered the Vethran corridor, that she had stayed because she had not wanted to leave, that she had thought about the 14 hours with a frequency she had not anticipated and could not reduce. She used words that his translation software flagged with small asterisks, indicating concepts that did not transfer cleanly into standard, and in the footnotes the software had done its earnest best to explain what the asterisked words carried. Something about recognition, something about courage that could not be taught, something about a decision made once that meant it did not have to be made again. She said she understood that this was unexpected. She said she thought he should know that she had declined 17 suitors, and that the number was not incidental, and that she was telling him because honesty seemed like the appropriate way to begin something that she hoped, if he was willing, might be worth beginning. At the bottom, in what appeared to be a postscript that had been added, and then almost removed, and then kept, she said she hoped he had fixed the secondary probe on his bioscanner, which she had noticed was reading amber when he used it on her, and that she had thought about that probe periodically, as a kind of indirect measure of whether the supply depot had managed to locate itself relative to the concept of timely delivery. Aiden sat on the crate for 4 minutes. Priya walked past the door twice. On the second pass she stopped. He showed her the message without saying anything. She read it, and then she sat down on the adjacent crate with the careful movement of someone respecting the weight of a moment. They were both quiet. Outside the bay, the station went about its business with the comprehensive indifference of infrastructure. She noticed the probe, Aiden said. She noticed the probe, Priya confirmed, in the middle of having shrapnel removed. But some people are observant. She's the heir to an interstellar empire. That would also explain the protocol section, Priya said. The first third of this message reads like it was written by a government building. And then it just becomes something else entirely, yes. She handed the comm unit back, the part about the 17 suitors. I know. She declined 17 people, and then sent you a postscript about your bioscanner. The probe was amber for 6 weeks, Aiden said, with the tone of someone identifying a mitigating factor. Priya looked at him for a moment. Tea, she said. This is a tea situation. She stood and went to the supply crate in the corner, the one that contained real tea, and put the heating element on with the focus of someone performing a task that was also buying time, which it was, for both of them. While the water heated, she said, without turning around, "What are you going to do?" Aiden looked at the message again. He read the asterisk section a second time and the footnotes that went with it, and then he read the postscript again, and he thought about the Vethran corridor, not in the abstract but specifically, the way specific memories surfaced when something called them directly. The quality of her stillness in the tent, the 11 hours she had stayed past her clearance, the way she had watched him work on the Vethran fighter without saying anything, without changing, just watching with the full attention of someone deciding something they were not going to undecide. He had noticed it at the time and put it somewhere in the back of his awareness without examining it, because the front of his awareness had been fully occupied, and the back was where things went when they were important but not urgent, and he was discovering now that they stayed there, in the back, intact and waiting, until something came along that made them urgent. "I'm going to respond," he said. "How?" "Honestly, at length." He paused. "I have questions." "I imagine you do. Practical ones about the logistics, the 3 systems." He stopped. There are 17 suitors. That were, Priya said, turning with 2 cups. Past tense, she declined all of them. For me, she declined 17 people for someone who had her name phonetically wrong on an intake form. Priya handed him his tea. Did you get it wrong? He thought about it partially. What did you write? He told her. Priya was quiet for a moment. That's not terrible. The second syllable is completely wrong. The spirit of it is there. The spirit of a name is not the name. No, she said, but it's something. It means you were paying attention even when you had other things to pay attention to. She drank her tea. Which is, if you think about it, the same thing she's saying about you. Aiden looked at her. She wasn't there to be observed. She was there to get her shrapnel out and leave. And instead she stayed for 11 hours and watched you work, and made a decision that she has apparently been committed to for 6 months without it wavering once. In the middle of an imperial court that has been producing increasingly decorated alternatives at regular intervals. Priya set down her cup. She's not confused about what she saw. She knew what she was looking for and she found it, and she's very clear about it. The one who is confused is you. I'm not confused, Aiden said. I'm processing. At some length. She sent me an imperial communication about the mate bond recognition protocol of an interstellar civilization. There is a reasonable amount of processing involved. Priya conceded this with a small gesture. Outside the bay, a docking announcement moved through the station speakers in 3 languages, the familiar routine of somewhere that existed to receive things and send them onward. Aiden finished his tea. He sat for a moment more with the empty cup and the message on his comm unit and the specific quality of a decision that had been forming without his full awareness, and was now simply present. The way arrived things were present, not as a choice that needed making, but as a fact that needed acknowledging. He opened a new document. He sat with it for a moment and then he began, in the careful way he did everything, and he wrote that he remembered her. That he remembered the tent and the 11 hours and the specific quality of her attention, which he had noticed and not examined until now. He wrote that he had questions, which were mostly practical but some of which were not, and that he was hoping she would be patient with the practical ones because they were the scaffold for the others. He wrote that he had looked up the Sekharan recognition vocabulary in the 20 minutes since reading her message, and that the footnote translations were approximate at best, but that what came through, even in approximation, carried a weight that he wanted to honor by not responding to it lightly, which was why this message was going to be longer than he usually wrote, and why it was going to take him the time it took. He wrote at the end that the secondary probe replacement parts had arrived 2 weeks ago, and the bioscanner was reading green on both indicators, and that he had thought about telling her this before he understood why it was the right way to end a message that was trying, in imperfect language across 3 systems, to say that he had been paying attention to, in the back of his awareness where things stayed intact and waited, and that when something came along and made them urgent, they were still there, unchanged, exactly as they had been left. He sent it. He set down his comm unit. Priya was looking at him from the doorway with the expression of someone watching something that was going to require more tea and more time, and probably a more fundamental reorganization of the future than either of them had anticipated this Wednesday. And he looked back at her and said, with the calm of someone who had just done the thing that scared him and found that the doing of it was, as the doing of things usually was, considerably more manageable than the waiting, that he thought he might need help with his Sekharan. Priya said she didn't speak Sekharan. He said he knew, but she was better at languages than he was. She said that was a very low bar. He said yes, but she was still going to help him, and she said fine, obviously, and went to make more tea. And somewhere 3 systems away on a world with double moons, and a court full of people who were about to have their understanding of several things significantly reorganized, a message arrived, and the woman who received it read it once and then read it again, and when she reached the last line about the bioscanner reading green, She sat for a moment with the stillness she used when she was feeling something she had not yet decided how to show, and then she called for Reth. And when Reth came, she simply held out the comm unit. And Reth read it and said nothing for a long time, and when she finally spoke, she said only that the second draft had been right, that honesty was always the correct scaffold, and that she would go inform the Empress. Zarin sat alone in the chamber for a while after that, with the double moons visible on the horizon, and the message still on her screen, and the long-held certainty of the last 6 months, settling into something quieter and more permanent than certainty, which was the feeling of a thing no longer waiting to be confirmed, but simply true, the way the moons were true, moving in their familiar arc across a sky that had always known where they were going.